When the spies came back after scouting the land of Israel, and they're supposed to give a report about what the land is like and how the Jews are supposed to conquer the land, we all know that everything goes really pear-shaped, and they give a very negative report. So that we know. Once you look at the details of what it is that they said about the land of Israel, some of the things that they said, you have to wonder, what were they actually thinking? And one of those is they say, V'sham ro'inu es hanefilim. Over there in the land of Israel, we saw something, a group of beings that are called Nephilim. And then they say, B'nei haNephilim. And these Nephilim, they're the descendants of the Nephilim. And this is where they make the famous comment that we saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and so were we in their eyes as well. The question is, what are Nephilim? And what were they trying to convey to the Jewish people at that point? So Rashi comments. It tells us Nephilim are giants. And the giants that are referred to when they say Nephilim, so we've had this word once before, right at the beginning of the Torah, when very early on in the early history of humankind, we have a story of Nephilim. So Rashi tells us that Nephilim refers to giants, and these giants are the descendants of Shamchazoi and Azoel. Okay? So I don't know who they are. And Shamchazoi and Azoel, they fell from the heaven in the time of the generation of Enosh. Okay, it's a fair amount of information that Rashi is giving us over here. And one of the things that you have to do anytime that you learn Rashi's commentary on the Torah, you have to wonder why he includes the information that he includes. So in this particular case, we want to understand why he's translating the word Nephilim specifically to mean giants. Then we want to understand why we have to know that these are the giants that came from Shamchazoi and Azoel. I mean, at the end of the day, whoever they are, and we're going to talk about that in a second, doesn't necessarily seem to be relevant to the storyline to know the names of their ancestors, because it says that the descendants of Shamchazoi and Azoel. Okay, who's Shamchazoi and Azoel, and why is it relevant to our story? And the other question we need to ask is, why is it relevant to know that all of this occurred in the time of the generation of Enosh? What's that got to do with the story? Okay, so that's what we're going to try and unpack over here. Let's go back to the backstory of Shamchazoi and Azoel, which, by the way, there are various sources, including different places in the Gemara and different Midrashim, and they have different versions of what their names are, just by the way. Rashi chooses the names Shamchazoi and Azoel out of basically three variations of what the names of these angels are. Well, and I've just given away that they're angels, but Rashi specifically chooses these two names, this particular version, Shamchazoi and Azoel, and that's also going to be relevant to the story. We're going to have to unpack why that, what that means at some point. But let's first try and understand the backstory of what's going on over here. What are these Nephilim? Who's Shamchazoi and Azoel? What's the story? So essentially, the Midrash tells us, and like I said, the Gemara speaks about it as well, that at a particular point in early history, there were angels who felt that if they were given the opportunity to live on earth, they would do a far better job than the humans. Now, if you put this into context, we're talking at the time of Enosh. Anybody remember what happened historically in the time of Enosh? Okay, it's very interesting, because the Torah says, after it describes to us the person Enosh, who then becomes the identifying personality of the entire generation, so the Torah tells us, Oz huchal likroi b'shem Hashem. It was at that time that people started to make Hashem's name less significant or less holy than it should have been. Huchal from the word chulin, which means something which is mundane. So they effectively desecrated Hashem's name. If you have a look in the Rambam, when he goes into the laws of idolatry, so he does something he doesn't do in any of the other sections of law. He gives us the historical background, which is really interesting. Before you get into what you may or may not do in the context of idolatry, he tells us how idolatry began. And he says, when did idolatry begin? In the time of Enosh. So that's soon, hey? That's not very long after Adam and Eve. And the angels look at this and they say, look at these human beings. You've only given them a few generations of life on earth, and they're already rejecting you, and they're starting to serve other beings, etc. We could do a better job. That's essentially what they're saying. We could do a better job. And Hashem essentially tells them, challenge accepted. And they come down, these angels, who Rashi's choosing the names Sham Chazoy and Azoel out of the pool of names that are used to refer to these angels. He's focusing on these particular names. Sham Chazoy and Azoel, they come down into this world, and guess what? They realize that there's such a thing as temptation, which angels are not familiar with. So it's all very well to sit on your spiritual perch and be critical of humans when you don't have a Yetzer Hara, and you don't have the pressures of earning a living, and you don't have the distractions of the things that the world has to offer. The minute they were exposed to all of these things, turns out they were worse than the humans. They not to say that they were worse beings, but their ability to withstand temptation was worse than that of the human beings. So the spies are now telling the Jewish people, you might remember that story from hundreds of years ago. There was that great scandal of these angels, the so-called fallen angels that came into this world, and they were unable to stand up to the challenges of the world. But they actually then had children with humans. And those children emerged as unusual. Maybe we can even call them superhuman beings. And these are the giants that we've encountered in Israel. So do you honestly think that you can take these people on? That's essentially the message that they're conveying to the Jewish people. And as you can well imagine, everybody was just a little bit nervous when they heard this information. Now the thing is, anytime that Rashi makes a comment on what's going on inside the verses of the Torah, there's a reason he's doing so. And the reason that always prompts Rashi to comment is that if you read the verse at face value, something about it is not going to make sense unless we explain it. So our question is over here, what did not make sense? What's grabbed Rashi's attention in this verse that causes him to give this whole explanation? And it is a relatively detailed explanation, because all Rashi really needs to do is identify who the spies are referencing. He doesn't have to tell us the whole backstory, that they come from Sham Chazoy and Azoel, who fell out of heaven. Like, we don't have to know that information, surely. All we have to know is, what are the people that the spies are describing? So most of the commentaries say what's bothering Rashi over here is that it says the word Nephilim twice in the same sentence. Right? It says, there we saw the Nephilim, who are the children of the Nephilim. So that seems like a little bit of superfluous information. And most of the commentaries say that's what's bothering Rashi, and that's why he's trying to explain what's going on over here and what Nephilim are. To which he explains that Nephilim are these strange, mythical beings who fell out of the heaven. That's why they're called Nephilim, from the word Norfel, which means to fall. So they fell out of heaven, and that's how they landed up over here. And then they spawned these unusual beings that look like humans, but apparently have some supernatural power to them. And needless to say, the Jews are going to be very afraid of having to try and contend with these individuals. Okay, that's basically how Rashi is describing it. Now, what makes this very difficult to understand is three things. Number one, it's not Rashi's job to teach us history. Sometimes you need to know the history in order to understand what's going on in the Torah. Fine. So in that case, he'll tell us the history. Like here, we need to know who the Nephilim are. Okay, so you've got to tell me the Nephilim. Now, would it have been any less meaningful for us if Rashi had said Nephilim means the descendants of fallen angels? Would have worked, right? Because what is Rashi trying to illustrate? He's trying to illustrate who these beings are and why the spies believe that everybody should be afraid of them. Do you understand the story better now that you know that their names were Sham Chazoy and Azoel? Does it help you? No. Sounds like trivia. And Rashi's not in the business of trivia. He's not in the business of filling in the gaps of a story, so we'll have a full version of the story. He's in the business of explaining the simple understanding of the verse. The simple understanding of the verse is the spies, as we well know, are trying to scare the Jewish people off from going to the land of Israel. So scare them by saying there are still beings over there who came from the fallen angels. That's all. I don't have to know the names of those angels. That's our first question with regards to Rashi. Second question is, again, Rashi is not a history reporter. So the fact is that the story of the fallen angels happened in the generation of Enosh. That is factual. But does it make any difference to our story when it happened? Our story is who's in the land now. That's all. That's what the spies want to convey. In the land right now are these powerful beings that you cannot vanquish. Why do I have to know that they came into this situation all the way back in the generation of Enosh? Why is that relevant to our story? Question 2. Question 3. This is not the first time we encounter the word Nephilim. As Rashi is telling us, this is something that occurred all the way back at the dawn of history in the generation of Enosh. So it's already been recorded in the Torah. In fact, go back to the very first parasha in the Torah, Bereshis, and you will see it uses the expression Hanephilim hayu ba'aretz, that the Nephilim were in the land at that time. Surely, the very first time we encounter the word Nephilim, surely Rashi, whose job it is to explain to us the simple meaning of the text, surely he's going to tell us what Nephilim are, right? So let's flip back the pages, go to that parasha, go to the very first reference to Nephilim, and let's see what Rashi has to say there. So what does he say? Not just does he not say the same thing as what he says here, but it actually appears as if Rashi says the opposite of what he says here. Here Rashi is telling us Nephilim means descendants of fallen angels, supernatural beings. Back there in Bereshis, the very first time we encounter the word Nephilim, he says Nephilim are human. Human, not fallen angels. In fact, in that context, because just after that the Torah talks about B'nai ha'Elokim, which sounds like the children of God, right? Although we also know that there are various places in the Torah where the word Elokim is also used to refer to angels. So B'nai Elokim could mean the children of angels, right? Guess what? Rashi there interprets B'nai Elokim, that Elokim means the powerful leadership of the world at the time, and it's just talking about regular human beings who happen to come from powerful families. So it sounds like Rashi originally, the first time we encountered the word Nephilim, sounds like he's giving us the exact opposite explanation of what he's given here. Here he's telling us that they are the children of fallen angels, which implies that they have some kind of supernatural powers, whereas over there he's calling them ordinary people, but powerful people. And by the way, that would have worked in our context, because the goal of the spies is to frighten the Jewish people. So frighten them by saying they're very powerful people living there. You don't have to tell me that they're supernaturally powerful. You could just say they're strong people. So why is Rashi changing his tune over here from what he said there? Oh, by the way, I've left out a key component, don't you think? What does the word Nephilim mean? It certainly doesn't mean powerful. So here, Rashi is telling us Nephilim means they fell out of the heavens. But there, where Rashi makes the argument that they're just strong people, how does he then interpret the word Nephilim, which obviously comes from the root Nophel, which means to fall?
The last letter is a mem or
a mem. Okay, so Nephilim means that they fell. Surely Rashi must explain the word over there in Bereshis, like he explains the word over here. Here he explains it to mean that they fell out of heaven. How does he explain it there? Very simply. Far more simply than what he does here. Far more simply. Rashi in Bereshis tells us that the word Nephilim means that these were people of great power who fell. Which is a pretty normal human experience. People fall. People mess up. People fail. That's what happened to them. Whoever they were and whatever their pedigree, they were people who at one point were prominent in society, and then because of their choices and their behaviors, they fell from prominence. Not only that, Rashi says because they were people of influence, when they fell, back then in the time of Enosh, when they fell, they actually caused other people to fall as well. Because that's often what happens. When you have people that are leadership or powerful members of society, everybody else follows their lead. And if they go through a bad patch, it can very often have a negative impact on society as large. And by the way, if we're talking about the generation of Enosh, that is a perfectly acceptable explanation. Because what was the generation of Enosh? The very first generation to have some kind of alternative to God. So I'm not going to call it flat out idolatry. The Rambam explains what happened over there and how the people at the time of Enosh had this belief, which was Hashem is too great to get involved in the nitty-gritty of daily life. So he outsourced and he delegated to underlings. And effectively what they believed at that time was that Hashem expects of us to show respect to his delegates. So whether those delegates were the forces of nature, or whether they were angels, or whether they were the astrological systems, didn't make a difference. In their minds, that's how you show respect to God, is you show respect to those who he has delegated power to. And that would be very much like in a human experience, right? So let's say, for argument's sake, you live in a country, and there's a president of the country. And everybody would say the appropriate thing is you show respect to the president, which is true. But then if the president appoints somebody as the governor of your state or the premier of your province, well then it's only appropriate out of respect to the president that you now show respect to his premier or to his governor. And in turn, if the governor now appoints the mayor of your city, then it's only appropriate that out of respect to the president, you show respect to the mayor. So that was effectively the argument that they were using. Hashem designed a system. There's a hierarchy in that system. And in that system, there are very powerful spiritual beings, and there are systems that work within the natural order that are more powerful than we are. You have to show some respect to that. And so eventually, only after time, not in that generation, but in subsequent generations, they started to blur the lines further, and they started to believe that it's not just that you respect Hashem by showing some kind of respect to the other entities, but you actually should engage those entities. So for example, if you have a good relationship with this particular spiritual being, you'll have more blessing in your life. And that's where they got all these weird ideas of things like the rain god and the god of war and all those kinds of things, because they then interpreted even further afield from where Hashem wants us to be, and they started to believe that there's power in all of these things. So these great leaders, they fell because the highest spiritual state is to be not only aware of but completely committed to Hashem. They fell from that. They started to give credence to other entities, and they caused the others around them to fall because they effectively started the whole of paganism that was going to endure for the rest of human history. So, if in Bereshis, the very first time that we encounter this concept of the Nephilim, Rashi was satisfied with telling us that Nephilim are ordinary people, just people with power, who made poor decisions that were bad for them and degraded them and degraded the people around them, why here is Rashi changing his tune and now calling the Nephilim something altogether different? The descendants of these angelic beings, they're so powerful. Like, it's very odd, right? Doesn't seem to make sense. And the reality is that if, as the commentaries want to say, the only reason Rashi is giving us this interpretation is because the word Nephilim is used twice in the verse, well, that wouldn't answer this question. It wouldn't answer why Rashi is now completely reinterpreted what Nephilim are. So we've got to really understand what's going on over here and understand what the message is that the spies were trying to convey at this point. And at this point is the key. At this point. See, unfortunately, what often happens to us, unless we are really paying attention, what often happens to us is we lump the whole story into some generalized version of the story. So in our minds, basically what happens is there's 12 tribes. Each one sends a representative to be a spy. They go off into the land of Israel. 10 of the 12 come back saying it's a disaster. We'll never be able to conquer this land. The people who live there are so powerful, they're even more powerful than Hashem. At least that's how the Gemara interprets it, and Rashi quotes it as well. And so this is a bad story, and we're in a tremendous amount of trouble. There are two voices, Yehoshua and Kalev, who say, no, you're getting the wrong end of the stick over here. Everything's good. Hashem is on our side. We shouldn't fear our enemies. Everything's going to be fine. Everybody, of course, shouts them down, And as we know, at the end of the story, people listen to the 10 rather than to the 2, which, by the way, is halachically correct because you're supposed to follow the majority, so you can kind of understand where they're coming from. That's how we generally see the story. But there's a very important nuance in the story which is relevant to our conversation. And that is, it's not like the spies came, made their presentation, everybody fell to pieces, and then Yoshua and Kalev tried to rebut them, and that didn't work. It was a little bit more dynamic than that. Spies came along, they gave their presentation, they freaked everybody out. Yoshua and Kalev, seeing the reaction, then got up and they pushed back. And they said, well, there's other information that they're not telling you, and the land is very good, and Hashem will definitely give us the ability to conquer the land. That calmed everybody, which made the spies uneasy because they were now losing the argument. So the spies came in for a round 2. After Yehoshua and Kalev, after they'd already given their presentation, the spies came in for a round 2 with a whole fresh set of insights about the land. And that totally scared the Jewish people. The verse we're looking at over here about these Nephilim, that's part of the second round of the presentation that the spies are giving, which means if we want to understand what their argument is at this point, their argument against going into Israel is, at this point, we're going to have to first check what did Yehoshua and Kalev say. Once we have that context, then we'll understand why they're now coming back with this particular argument, which will also help us to understand why Rashi is interpreting these Nephilim in this particular way. In fact, differently to how he interpreted Nephilim originally. So essentially, in order to understand what's going on over here, we have to construct a proper chronology of how the arguments went, truly understand what each side is saying, and then the story is going to make a lot more sense.